Hi, good morning in Asia and also good evening in the USA at Stanford campus. This is Suk-Jong Lee, the Senior Fellow at East Asia Institute and also Professor at Sungkyunkwan University. I am going to moderate this webinar, and this webinar is very special. This is the kind of first webinar co-hosted by Myanmar Democracy Research Network and Asia Democracy Research Network. And today we are going to invite Larry Diamond, and he's going to speak about the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of democracy in Asia. And as you know, this pandemic has many implications economically and also geopolitically. And other aspect of this pandemic influence is on democracy. As you can witness, many autocratic governments are weaponizing this pandemic to oppress the opponents' opinions, and even and also it's very difficult for citizens to mobilize protest. And even in democracies, government can come to have many personal informations to control this pandemic. And we worry about the individual's privacy rights and many issues. So this is very important topic, and so I'm very pleased to invite our speaker, Larry Diamond. Can his screen pops up? Okay, so let me introduce Larry, our longtime friend. And Larry Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the IIS at Stanford University, and he's also professor by courtesy of political science and sociology at Stanford University. Larry served many posts inside the university, including directorship at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And Larry also served in Baghdad as a senior advisor on governance to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. And I'm sure you have read his wonderful books and articles. And the most recent one I enjoyed very much is Irwin's Saving Democracy from Russia Raids, Chinese Ambition and American Complacency. They came out last year, and what a wonderful titles. And this book is very recommendable with the deep analysis and also very rational prescriptions. So I highly recommend the students and scholars to read this one. And also he wrote The Spirit of Democracy and other, maybe he edited more than 50 books. And Larry is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. So I'm very glad. And also we have three excellent distinguished panelists who will discuss Larry's presentation. And the first discussant is Professor Francisco Magno, and he's a professor at De La Salle University and director at the Robredo Institute of Governance in Philippines. And our second discussant is Professor Maiko Ichihara at Hitotsubashi University, Japan. And right now, Maiko is visiting Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And our third discussant is Kai Nguyen, Executive Director of Sandi Governance Institute in Myanmar. Okay, so this is a great time. And Larry is going to speak the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of democracy in Asia. So without further ado, I will give a microphone to Larry.
Okay, thank you, Suk-Jong, and thank you all of my colleagues who are joining us. It's my honor to be able to launch this webinar series at a very sobering and I think important time in the history of democracy in the world. Before I come to Asia, I want to speak a little bit about global trends in the world with respect to to democracy. And I want to note that we are now in the 14th year of a democratic recession that I think began around 2006 and has seen democracy really slide back in the world. We've seen very significant retreats of freedom, constitutionalism, rule of law, checks and balances, and that these have been accelerating in recent years, particularly in the last few years. I've actually broken up the last 45 years of the third wave of global democratization into 5-year segments. And if you do that, what you find is that only in this very recent 5-year segment of, say, 2015 through 2019, do we see for the first time a significantly greater number of countries moving away from democracy than toward democracy. And that really is Huntington's definition of a reverse wave of democratic breakdowns. If that were to continue through several more years, I think it would signify not only that the third wave is over, I think the third wave of democratic expansion probably came to an end some years ago, but that we've decisively entered a reverse wave of democratic regression in the world. And the second point that needs to be made, which many of you are living through, I think Francisco is likely to have some relevant and very pertinent things to say about this with respect to the Philippines. But if we were to talk about India or Bangladesh, we could say so as well. And Sukjong, I don't want to put you in a difficult spot, but even in South Korea, concerns have been raised about democratic regression and hegemonic tendencies on the part of the ruling party. And I think a very brave and insightful and important article by my colleague at Stanford University, Gi-wook Shin, in the July issue of the Journal of Democracy, which has just come out. I'll see if I can find the title, but I really urge everyone to read this article, South Korea's Democratic Decay. In South Korea, no one is suggesting that South Korea is no longer a democracy, but the point is, even in a liberal democracy like South Korea, Professor Shin is arguing, we're seeing some of the same tendencies of presidential excess, intolerance of opposition, overriding of constitutional checks and balances, kind of intimidation of opposition and dissent in quiet ways. Obviously, with what Francisco is living with in the Philippines is much more blatant and alarming. And then you can move from the Philippines to Bangladesh and find a country where, you know, some years ago, democracy ceased to exist because of the extreme nature of prime ministerial concentration and abuse of power. I think the summary point to be made, Sukjong, is that we don't see democracy expiring in Asia or more broadly in the world in the way it used to expire by military coup in the Philippines or in Latin America or something. We don't see it expiring even by the sudden seizure of executive power and suspension of the Constitution and declaration of emergency rule that happened in the Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos and briefly happened during emergency rule in India in 1975. You see a more insidious, incremental, and subtle pattern of executive enlargement of power and a kind of creeping, there's a term that's actually become popular in comparative politics, authoritarianization. that is the inverse of democratization, but a creeping expansion of executive power, whether presidential or prime ministerial, a creeping subjugation of the judiciary. Suk-jong, thank you for your kind words about my book, Yale Wins. As you know, I talk in there about the autocrat's 12-step program. And the early steps involve subverting and undermining the independence of the judiciary, of independent institutions of oversight and horizontal accountability in the executive branch, intimidating the media and arresting journalists and forcing independent media entrepreneurs even out of business, or to sell their TV stations and newspapers if they want to avoid complete ruin, or else fall into line in praise of the ruling party and the ruling head of government, which is a creeping process that's been underway for several years in India now, and not enough has been written about that. You hound dissidents and you claim that they are enemies of the people, a common and popular phrase among illiberal and authoritarian populists who embark on this project of this 12-step program of concentration of power and decimation of checks and balances. And once you have subverted one by one all the institutions of horizontal accountability, the judiciary, the independent auditors, the independence of the prosecutorial authority, the independence and autonomous power of the legislature. You go on to finally subvert the electoral process, which is what Sheikh Hasina Wajed did in Bangladesh a number of years ago, when she abandoned the customary process of leaving power 3 months before the election to a caretaker government, so that the country could know that there would be independent, neutral, free and fair administration of the electoral process. And then I think this was around 2014, the opposition boycotted the election and she won a landslide, and democracy hasn't recovered since. We have a situation in Sri Lanka now where the authoritarian Prime Minister Rajapaksa was defeated in an election 5 years ago, and democracy was recovered with a lot of shortcomings and a lot of vulnerabilities, but at least a return to a rough form of democracy. And now, out of concerns about terrorism, which is a problem that is frequently manipulated, if not invented, by these authoritarian populists, the Rajapaksa brothers, in this case, the former defense minister, they've returned to power. The other Rajapaksa is now the president. The former prime minister and president will now probably return to being prime minister again. And this is, the dilemma that people are struggling with in Sri Lanka, and frankly, in much of Asia. I'm not going to say too much about the Philippines. I think Francisco will probably have some comments about that. But this is a candidate, Rodrigo Duterte, in 2016, who made no bones about what his intentions would be in terms of decimating the rule of law and undermining human rights and civil liberties, with the vague claim that he was fighting drug trafficking and, trying to reduce crime. And this is just the kind of general trend in the world where our focus is on Asia. So I'm not going to, go into too much detail about what's been happening in Africa or Latin America or Central and Eastern Europe or so on and so forth. but I'll just say it's been a global trend. And in some cases, the retreat is briefer. I'm sorry, I have my own authoritarian personality that I'm struggling with in my household. You can probably hear her barking. Let me just see if I can placate her. Sometimes it's easier to placate an authoritarian canine than an authoritarian person. So this is the general global trend, and it also needs to be said that while the general numbers in terms of the decline of freedom are worrisome in the world, they're also deceptive, because they don't show, to my mind, the real extent of authoritarian tendency, because they don't take into account the fact that it is, in many cases, the bigger, more consequential, more geopolitically weighty countries in the world that are moving backwards and declining in terms of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and civil liberties. And of course, there's no bigger democracy than India, which I think is very well advanced in a process of at least decline of the liberal aspects of democracy, of civil liberties and media independence and a pluralism and openness of intellectual debate. And there's no more powerful and important democracy than the United States. And I can answer questions later if you have them. I won't go into detail here about the US again, since the focus is on Asia, but the decline in democracy in the United States as a result of the authoritarian personality and values of Donald Trump, and as a result of his assaults on the rule of law and independent checks and balances, again, have been very pronounced and are very well reflected in the decline in Freedom House ratings. And then you could go on again, maybe we'll hear about the Philippines. Indonesia's the second largest democracy in Asia. It's holding and managed to, I'd say, dodge a bullet in the recent presidential elections, where a deeply authoritarian populist personality, the former son-in-law of Suharto, was running once again for the presidency and fortunately lost. But there's still a lot of problems of religious intolerance and illiberalism with respect to democracy in Indonesia. I want to take a few minutes in conclusion to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on all of this. Before I do so, I just want to say these trends were very far along before the COVID pandemic began to erupt in early part of 2020, or even before it became visible in December of 2019. And we could talk about, Kind Wen will probably do so, the stalling of the democratic transition in Burma. We could talk about the crushing of any democratic ember of pluralism in China and the concentration of power in Xi Jinping. We could talk about the demise of any fragment of opposition in Cambodia. We could talk about the military's rigging of the political process in Thailand and the maneuvering of the military autocrat of himself into the position of prime minister. It's just very hard to find in Asia, a country that's really trending in a decidedly positive direction. Indeed, the only one that I think is, or at least is holding its ground in the wake of all this, is the country that China insists is not a country, namely the Republic of China, Taiwan, which is possibly the most liberal democracy in the region now. So about COVID, Suk-jong, I'll make the following points. The first is, we know from the experience of Taiwan and Korea, and I think we could also say Japan, but I hope Maiko will speak to this, that democracy is not an obstacle to effective management of the COVID-19 pandemic, because Taiwan, most of all, but also I believe Korea, and certainly compared to most other countries in the advanced industrial world, Japan, have done a pretty admirable job of controlling the virus by listening to their public health experts, by imposing disciplined policies of quarantining, mask wearing, testing, contact tracing, and by having an effective, competent state in which the head of government listens to the public health authorities, and which the public health authorities have learned from the previous SARS epidemic and other public health crises. The second point is that I think we would still be looking at a bad situation in India and Bangladesh and the Philippines and Thailand and so on, even without this pandemic ever having happened. But as you said in your introduction, the pandemic has done two things that have served autocracies and aspiring autocrats extremely well. Number one, it has struck fear in populations and given aspiring autocrats an excuse to crack down on freedom and to depict opponents and critical media as somehow threatening public health or public safety. And of course, whenever there is some kind of crisis or existential threat to public health or public safety, it always creates an opportunity for autocratically minded rulers to exploit it for their own nefarious ends. And the second thing it's done has been, and I think this will be the longer lasting impact that we really need, and I hope your institute, the East Asia Institute, can do some work on this. We really need to think about and engage on as a democratic community. This has given governments digital tools of tracking individuals and their whereabouts and who they've come in contact with, that if applied narrowly for limited periods of time with proper oversight and legislative authorization and proper management of who stores the data and how it can be used, and proper sunset clauses to ensure the demise and deactivation of these contact tracing apps on people's mobile phones when the health crisis is past. If we have all that, then the net benefit to society can be significantly positive by aiding with contact tracing and monitoring of people who have the virus. But this is really not what a lot of these dangerous, autocratically minded rulers have intended. They see in these contact tracing apps and in the excuse that the coronavirus gives their government to mandate the implementation of these apps on people's mobile phones, a perfect opportunity to deprive people of their liberty, to monitor the opposition, and possibly to store people's health data as a weapon against them in the future, or to go beyond what the apps say they're intended to do, to download people's text messages, their email, who they're in contact with, who they're meeting with. This is an enormous threat to human freedom. And it's extremely important that any society that implements these mobile phone contact tracing apps do so with very strong, independent, neutral supervision and oversight and legal provisions for their containment. I urge people to go to the website of the MIT Technology Review, which has an excellent tracking framework for which countries are adopting these apps and to what extent the adoption of these apps is complying with the 5 principles of democratic responsibility that a mobile tracing app should have in order to comply with international human rights provisions. If we don't get this right now, government may permanently implant itself into our mobile phones in a way that would significantly degrade human rights and democratic possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. That's fascinating talk. I cannot agree anymore about this issue of privacy, even among the democracies. And I will definitely look at this MIT review you have mentioned. Okay, now I will invite the 3 discussants. And the first discussant is Francisco. Francisco, it's your turn.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you also to Professor Larry Diamond for that very interesting and superb, excellent presentation of the challenges to democracy in Asia. Larry's use of the term creeping authoritarianism, I think, perfectly fits what's happening in the Philippines. His reference to the latest wave of democratic recession is precisely what happened over the last few years in the Philippines. In relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say that the casualties in this war, the Philippine president likes to use those terms, war, fighting. It's really the democratic, the further erosion of democratic processes in the context of a public health emergency. And there is a lot of assessments saying that because of limited public deliberations, it has led to poor health outcomes because it shows in the record that the Philippines actually is not doing very well in Southeast Asia when it comes to performance in handling the COVID pandemic. Of course, during this emergency, an emergency law was passed with the support of Congress. Larry was saying that this democratic recession has been happening even before the pandemic, and that was precisely what was observed in the Philippines. The erosion happened with the diminution of these horizontal checks and balances with the creation of a supermajority in Congress. The representatives, especially in the House of Representatives, are really aligned with the president. We have to also look at the appointments in the Supreme Court. Mostly schoolmates of the president were appointed over the last few vacancies in the Supreme Court. And so what's the consequence of this? It showed in the voting on very important legislation. Let me cite just last week, the legislative franchise for the operation of a very big media network known for its independent stand on many issues and for also broadcasting criticisms of the president. Basically, Congress closed this big media network. It happened through a vote of the Committee on Legislative Franchise, so it did not even reach a plenary session. We also saw the conviction of, in the lower court, it's still subject to appeal, of online news media Chief Executive Officer Maria Ressa. So many media personnel are saying that there is a chilling effect that's happening right now, 2 years before the elections. We have to note that the anger of the president was really precipitated by his contention that that news media network whose legislative franchise has not been renewed did not broadcast his campaign video. Also, just a few weeks ago, Congress passed an anti-terrorism law that legalizes warrantless arrests of suspected terrorists. And the criticism here is that the definition of terrorists in the law is very vague. So it can even be applied to the legitimate opposition because the interpretation will be done by an anti-terrorism council to be made of members appointed by the chief executive. So the problem here is that it will not be the courts anymore who will issue arrests, but this anti-terrorism council whose members will be appointed by the executive. So that supports Larry's contention of this expansion of executive power. So basically moving into a kind of quasi-judicial power. So since it's really a short period of time for discussion, let me wrap up this discussion. Potential areas for democratic renewal, just very listing of some ideas. Despite the closure of this this big media network, a survey was done recently, just before the voting in Congress for the renewal of this legislative franchise of this independent media network. 75% of Filipinos said that they support the renewal of the legislative franchise and therefore supporting press freedom. So 3 out of 4 Filipinos are actually supportive of press freedom. There were already opposition cases filed against the implementation of the anti-terrorism law. So there are, I think, 7 cases filed in the highest court to nullify the anti-terrorism law that enables warrantless arrests. There is also a campaign to link those representatives who voted in favor of the closure of the independent media network to link it to the campaign in the 2022 elections, therefore signaling that they don't want the allies of the executive to remain in power after 2022. There is also a renewed effort to pass a freedom of information law. And finally, just 2 days ago, the spokesperson of the president was saying that the president was not involved in the closure of that big media network. But in fact, in a speech, in a non-edited speech that came out, he was saying that he was very happy that he was able to destroy the oligarchs, meaning the big media owner is part of the oligarchs. He was able to destroy the oligarchs without martial law. So basically, I think that supports Larry's statement that you don't need martial law like what happened in the Philippines when Marcos declared martial law, but you can do it through the existing electoral processes. So that is simply just to support this idea of a creeping authoritarianization, or perhaps another term would be autocratization. So thank you, Professor Lee.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Okay, and now let me invite Maiko as a second discussant.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Larry, for the fascinating talk. Well, I'm really glad that you talked about the recession of democracy, even going back to pre-COVID era, to remind us that this democratic recession is not a unique trend only during this COVID pandemic. Well, because of the shortage of time, I think I'm going to the question part directly. apparently there are a number of cases where democracy has been under a severe attack in Asia, including freedom of speech, freedom of press, civil society, rule of law, and so forth. But at the same time, there are also cases where while the public attention has been on the COVID-19, some countries are undermining the human rights and the rule of law for the domestic arena. And two very problematic cases that, well, from my point of view, are Hong Kong and Malaysia. In the case of Hong Kong, I think today or recently, the U.S. Congress had the introduction of Hong Kong Safety Harbor Act and Hong Kong Freedom and Choice Act to help Hong Kong activists and also average people to escape from the region for their safety. And this kind of thing has to be done, has to be discussed in Asia as well, especially Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and India, those democratic countries. And luckily, in the case of Japan, it might be also the case in South Korea. I'm not sure, but we are now enjoying an increase of opposition to the national security law amongst parliamentarians in Japan, journalists, activists, and scholars, and they are showing sympathy toward pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong and amplifying their voices. But at the same time, those countries also have the fear of being dragged into the U.S.-China confrontation, which has been intensifying. And so, related to this Hong Kong issue, I have actually two questions. One is how we should sort of lobby or how we should talk to those governmental officials to implement the same kind of measures as Safe Harbor Act or Free and Choice Act to support Hongkongers. And related to that, China could request data on actually foreigners who show support for Hong Kong. And if tech companies comply with this data request, then it could set the model and lead other countries to do the same of giving Hongkongers data and also foreigners data who support those pro-democracy activists. But that's going to have a very detrimental impact, not only to Hongkongers but also but to the entire actually world. So the second question is, what kind of attitudes do the tech companies have now about these data requests, possible data requests from Hong Kong? And what kind of moves are they taking right now? And what should we do about it? Thank you.
Now, I'd like to invite Kain Min from Burma, Myanmar.
Myanmar. Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you, Professor Larry Diamond, for your very insightful explanation about the recession of democracy and especially digital privacy, the danger posed to digital privacy. So all of us are really concerned about this issue. And first, I would like to talk about the general context of our country during the pandemic. Actually, we don't have a good democratic neighbors, as you mentioned, as Larry mentioned in his presentation, Thailand, Bangladesh, Malaysia. But at the same time, we have authoritarian countries around us. So and then so if you look at them, yeah, most of the authoritarian countries, they are quite successful in controlling the infection. Vietnam, China, compared to U.S. Not U.S., Italy, they are actually which are democracies. So we are in very difficult position. But fortunately in Myanmar, I think let me use Francis Fukuyama three criteria. So the state capacity, social trust, and leadership. So in our country, especially in Burma, I think especially in Burma majority states and Burma majority region, social trust uh, and leadership, we can see very good examples. Actually, yeah, the civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, yeah, they are taking the humane approach to the controlling the contagions. So they actually none of no one will be there. Their slogan is "No one left behind." No one left behind. In their COVID economic relief plan, also they announced that no one will be left behind. So everybody will be safe. So, that approach our government has taken. That's very good. And then the communities, especially rural community and social trust and public participation contribute to the effective uh, controlling of the infection. Actually, rural community they they took measures to contain the infection. For example, in villages, they set up the quarantine center on their own, and then they accepted the returnee migrant workers from Thailand, China, but they don't let them come into the village. First, they have to stay at the quarantine center. That's why I think that so the we can control the COVID infection quite effectively, and as you know, cases are number of cases are very low. And then during that pandemic period, we can actually promote participation. But in Myanmar, especially people, public, especially they use social media, and then they discuss about pandemic and other issues very freely, not quite freely, and that I think that is good for our country's democracy. I think that some people may think that it is not good, so it can hinder the development because sometimes government they have to pay attention to so many voices or something like that. But at the same time, I think that that is public participation and public trust in the state in the government. Although the state capacity in terms of health is very, as you know, is very weak. Very weak. We don't have less than one bed per 1,000 people, something like that. So I think that's why uh, we cannot say that authoritarian model is better than democracy, or no, democracy is better than authoritarian model. I think it depends on. I agree with Fukuyama. I think that it depends on leadership. It depends on social trust, and then now government is trying to upgrade, trying to uplift the health system as much as possible. That's good, but I think in the long run, the main challenge for us is economy. Economy, as you know, our economy is still very very weak. So the migrant people, more than 3 million people, so who are working in neighboring countries, they are returning home. They are returning home, and remittances are very now remittances collapse. So these challenges has to government has to address. But at the same time, our country stay in transition period. So we and then also we have conflicts in not only in Eastern Myanmar but also in Western Rakhine state. So so my question to Larry is, and then we have a very two giant neighbors, India and China. As you mentioned in your presentation, also India's democracy is also, we can say, the reversing or something like that. The liberal institutions are the government is trying to erode liberal institutions and freedom of expression restricted, something like that. At the same time, China also they trying to exert its influence, especially the increases influence on neighboring country during the pandemic period. So I think that right now the civilian government they have to strike a very delicate balance. Military, but in our country, military is also showing their willingness to cooperate with the civilian government during the to control the to control the contagion. Maybe they are, maybe they have other agenda for, because in our country 2020 elections will be held in November. So election is coming closer, and maybe they have commander in chief may have a political ambition. But in any way, during the pandemic, there are good things and bad things, but but positive. Many of the but positive side is higher than more than the negative sides, in my opinion. But especially negative things are happening in conflict of affected areas. Because of the conflict and the IDP camp, they don't receive assistance. So in the future, how can we actually balance economic interests and then promotion of democracy in our country? That's very important, because we have to rely a lot on actually uh, China and Thailand, because most of our export go to China, natural gas and agricultural produce. So how can we actually convince the West that it is time for them to come and engage, to actually accelerate their engagement with with the civilian government, because a civilian government is trying its best to maintain stability in Myanmar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Kind. Actually, I'm collecting questions similar to the questions raised by discussants to Larry, like Hitaeang has raised a question about how we should prioritize between democratic practices and also the necessary executive control to flatten the pandemic. So that is the question. And also another question by Gerald Sandler. He must be he, right? He asks how the United Nations or other regional organization make sure the governments comply with the democratic principles and measures. Maybe that includes the MIT rules Larry has mentioned. So those are the questions. Of course, I'll toss more questions from the participants to this webinar, because originally 150 people signed up. So, okay, Larry, you want to respond to the many questions raised by the three discussants?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me first come to Maiko's questions. and which I think are, you know, all of the questions related to China are only going to grow more important over time. And there's certainly, in the wake of the tragic demise of Hong Kong's autonomy in recent weeks, which I think is a major world historical event, that because we are in the midst of a pandemic, we haven't adequately processed. But it is an act of aggression against freedom. It is a violation of its obligations under international law. And I fear, one of you, I think it was Maiko, made some reference to this. It could be a harbinger of more to come, particularly with respect to Xi Jinping's, I think, thinly concealed aspiration to bring Taiwan to its knees. And I cannot emphasize enough how important I think it is for Xi Jinping and the senior Chinese Communist leadership to be made to pay a very heavy price for what they have done to betray their obligations under the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration and under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, of course, to the people of Hong Kong, but to the people of the rest of the People's Republic of China as well. And in this regards, Maiko, I would say, first of all, that all the democracies of the region, I think, should enact bills like the US has done, and sanctions like I hope the US will be moving toward, to impose costs and penalties on the Chinese Communist Party ruling elite for what they're doing in Hong Kong, and to hold them accountable. I think the other major liberal democracies of the region in Asia, and of course, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, Britain, other European countries, should definitely provide refuge for Hong Kong people whose liberty is under grave threat because of China's growing aggression and shadow. Maiko, with respect to your second question on China's request for foreigners' data, of course, they're going to want my data too under these circumstances. And I think every democracy should pass a law that makes it a criminal offense for any social media company to turn over the data of their own citizens to a foreign government without a court order to justify that under the rule of law. And once the social media companies have that explicit legal protection, they're strengthened in their ability to say to the Chinese government, sorry, if we have to choose between obeying the laws of the country that we are based in, or obeying the hollow claims to legality that you're putting forward here, we're going to obey our own country laws. And I think this is really now fundamental to the protection of civil liberties. More generally, I think that, of course, to Kind Win, I understand the difficult bind that Myanmar is in right now. You live in what we call a dangerous neighborhood. And so you can't just thumb your nose at China and pretend that it has no ability to retaliate against you. You're in a vulnerable situation. But I think one thing you can do and must do, frankly, is to gradually, quietly, incrementally diminish your economic dependence on the People's Republic of China. And look, I'm very troubled by, I have to be honest with you, Aung San Suu Kyi and her government's, lack of adequate fidelity to international human rights norms with regard to the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State. And I think our concern about this and our disappointment with Dao Su has to be continually reiterated. At the same time, I recognize that she's got a lot of difficulties and constraints she's facing with respect to China, with respect to the military in her own country and so on, as does Myanmar. And look, we expended a lot of energy and resources to try and create a new path for Myanmar after the change in course that the military took in 2008 and 2010. And that was a very important redirection that we don't want to see lost. So, sometimes you have to walk a very delicate, fine line. And you do what you can in any moment to assert your autonomy and reduce your dependence. And sometimes, and I think this is certainly the case for Japan and Korea, most of all of the countries we're talking about, you can be a little bit more forthright in saying some things are wrong and we're not going to stand for them. And we're going to register our very clear opinion. And what the People's Republic of China is doing to Hong Kong now is deeply wrong from a legal and moral standpoint. And I can't emphasize enough how important I think it is that Asian countries speak out against this, and not simply the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the European Union. With respect to the Philippines, I would say about the Philippines what I'd say about all these countries and about Hong Kong as well. The last line of defense for freedom within countries and across them within a region is civil society. And civil society, sometimes, unfortunately, easy for me to say, I'm sitting here in the US, needs to take risks to stand up for principles and to draw boundaries around what governments can do and get away with. And when civil society does that in one country, they need and deserve the support and solidarity of civil society elsewhere. And well, on the intellectual and analytic side, the East Asia Institute is an important manifestation, not only in Korea, but of course regionally, of Asian civil society. And Suk-jong, I think you can do a lot of good by continuing to raise these issues and provide platforms. And of course, there are forums for Democrats and civil society in Asia to do this more pointedly, to provide platforms for Democrats in Asia to come together and defend one another and lobby their own governments to take more forward-leaning stands in defense of these human rights principles. There is strength in numbers, there is strength in solidarity, and we have to, we have to deploy that as best we can.
Thank you, Larry. Actually, if I may, there are questions from participants about the role of America in promoting global democracy, because American democracy is in chaos, I'm sorry to say, all these racial issues and many things, and your society is very divided. So democracy has been part of America's foreign policy, but that seems to stop at some point. And now we cannot expect the leadership from American government as we used to do. So at this kind of juncture, what like Asian Democracy Research Network or ADNs or even many regional organizations, even United Nations, who should take a leadership to promote democracy, to defend the democracy, even though you had just suggested EAI to provide a platform for democracy to come together. I wish more concrete idea, especially from the American civil society and American government.
Well, I think we can anticipate that if former Vice President Biden is elected president on November 3rd, which I'd say is looking increasingly likely, and we're now looking at the possibility of, frankly, one of the largest landslide presidential election results in many years. If Biden does win, I think that there will be a return to democracy being an important pillar. It can never be the only one. It may not be the single most important one, but I think it will be an important and declared one in America's global engagement and certainly in its engagement in Asia. But even if that were to happen, the United States can't do it alone. We need alliances. And unfortunately, under Donald Trump, our alliances have eroded both in Northeast Asia and in Europe. And so I think our trans-Pacific alliances and transatlantic alliances need to be restored on an urgent basis. I think that will happen very rapidly if Biden wins. I predict it will be priority number one for Vice President Biden if he's elected president. Priority number one on the international stage will be to restore those two alliances. And, then we have to work to gradually turn back these negative trends in one country after another and draw strength from the legitimacy we have by being a trans-regional network which has international norms and legitimacy on its side to point to some of the erosion that's been happening in a number of our democracies and call our countries to a higher standard and to identify a particularly serious and existential threat to these common values. And that is the existential threat that comes from the growing sharp power and even hard power of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you. I think I have to wrap up this webinar, and I'd like to thank you, Larry Diamond. He has been very, very tired over the last week with a lot of commitment, but still he kindly agreed to speak in this webinar. So thank you, Larry, very much. And we'll let you go back to your dog. He or she is waiting so long for your love and care. And I'd like to thank you, Maiko, Francisco, and Kind for participating as a wonderful panelist. Thank you. And we'll continue this kind of webinar to hear your concerns and your excellent opinions about the idea how we can promote and defend the democracy, not only in this region and in the world. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.